In part 1 of the creation of life, we talked about protein formation, the very first step necessary for life to form naturally, and the formidable odds against the probability of the natural process being responsible for life to arise. Our DNA is the blueprint inside every cell that virtually explains how to build all the proteins in our body. Inside is encoded the very language in which God used to create life. Inside every 100 trillion cells in your body include the DNA in which we find this incredible coded language. If we were to open up this double helix and stretch it out, it would span 6 feet in length. This is found in every single one of our cells. This code is comprised of a 4-character chemical alphabet that precisely spells out the assembly instructions for all the thousands of different proteins in how your body is constructed. In fact, DNA is the most efficient and most dense information storage system in the known universe. Modern science cannot come anywhere near in replicating what the DNA can do in containing information. Picture a teaspoon of peanut butter. Imagine that this peanut butter represents pure DNA. How much genetic information can this teaspoon of DNA hold? It can hold all of the precise assembly instructions for all of the proteins of every one of those 100 million species of animal life on Earth that have ever existed. And it would still have the capacity left over for all of the information in every book ever written in human history. This is what we call unbelievably stupendous efficiency. Not only are these DNA able to replicate themselves quickly and efficiently, but it is also programmed with mechanisms that can detect and correct replication errors. They are self-correcting. There are special proteins called enzymes that actually move up and down the DNA molecule, seeking out and making repairs on a second-by-second basis. It was magnificently designed with editorial capabilities like an editor who reads through newspaper articles correcting any mistakes before being released. In the scientific study called information science, one of the laws of information science is that information never originates spontaneously in matter. If we were able to trace the copying of information back to its source, it always comes back to a mind. So since we have a creative information in DNA, that tells us it comes from intelligence. It is not something that can possibly come through millions of years of mutations or natural selection. It simply will not work. Even the DNA molecule is simple when compared to cells. Each cell functions as a city. When considering how the human body is comprised of trillions of cells working together as one unit, we should be in humble awe of our Creator's intimate care and perfect wisdom. So let's then take a glance at what these cell cities look like. When we look within a cell, it is not just a simple blob with a few strands of DNA floating around. It is important to truly appreciate the complexity of what is going on inside. It is like a highly organized city with a transportation system and infrastructure. Workers, or proteins, work in a power plant or mitochondria. And trucks, kinesin and DNA, travel along roads, actin fibers and microtubules, whose cargo are containers or vesicles that travel from factories or ribosomes that make proteins. There is a library, a genome, post office, inside of which the Golgi apparatus sorts, packages, and modifies macromolecules for secretion or for delivery to other organelles. And we have a police, the chaperones. Wayward or malformed proteins get a ticket, ubiquitin, and then get shipped off for degradation. Cells are also involved in exporting and importing. Communications and regulation occurs through complex signaling pathways that help keep everything running smoothly. Still think this all came about by chance mutations? Inside a cell, things can be transported in two ways. The first is by diffusion, in which small molecules are released and just wander around. This is usually used for small molecules like ATP, which is the fuel that is used to power molecular motors. The second way is through active transport that works like container shipping. Container shipping revolutionized the shipping industry. Rather than stacking sacks of sugar on ships, the sacks are placed in metal containers that can be stacked on the decks of ships and then later transferred from the ship onto 18-wheeler trucks. Here's the amazing part. Similar to the shipping industry, cells pack cargo into small bags called vesicles. These vesicles have motor proteins attached to their outside. There, motor proteins have two legs and can walk just like a person, putting one foot in front of another. Can you really believe it? These walk along roads that are thin filaments of polymers. And as these walk along these roads, they haul the cargo vesicles. These cargoes can be a wide variety of things. For example, vesicles can contain pigment which, when spread out, will change the color of a skin cell. Or the cargo can be mitochondria, which is a power plant or organelle that makes ATP. The roads are of two types. Microtubules, MT, are like national or interstate highways. They spread radially outward from the nucleus of the cell like highways leading away from a major city. Actin filaments, or AF, are like local surface streets that are randomly placed. This transportation system is also regulated. For example, pigment cells in frogs change color when they get scared by a predator. When the pigment granules are spreading out from the nucleus, they will go straight through actin filament intersections until they get to the end of the filament. When the granules need to return to the nucleus, cargoes will often switch at actin filament intersections as if to find the nearest on-ramp to a microtubule. As noted earlier, molecular motors have two legs and can take one step at a time. The motor, called kinesin, walks outwards along microtubules towards the periphery of the cell and takes 8 nanometer steps. The motor, called dynein, walks along microtubules inwards toward the nucleus. Dr. Roop Malik at the University of California, Irvine, has found that dynein effectively has a transmission or gear shift. It can take steps of varying sizes, 8, 16, 24, or 32 nanometer steps, depending on the load it is hauling or on the amount of ATP or fuel that is available. Under a heavy load, it takes small steps. Under no load and with lots of ATP available, it takes large steps. The book of Genesis was written by Moses somewhere between 1445 to 1405 BC. The account of the creation of Eve and Adam was formed from the dust of the ground. It was carefully recorded that God did not go back to the dust to form Eve. Rather, God chose to form Eve as a perfect and suitable helper and companion for Adam from a part of his own body. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The idea of taking a bone and growing a new person from it seems quite strange, particularly from a rib. Why the rib? Why not any other part? As we look more closely to the story, we will find out that God knew exactly what he was doing. By making a perfect match for Adam, using his DNA makes perfect sense. We see throughout creation that when God creates the diversity of animals on Earth, he doesn't go about having to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, each time one is made. Each mammal species have similar parts to them: a spine, rib cage, skull, nervous system. Thus each type is wonderfully made by him, and the DNA information in each of these creatures vary quite little within its code. By looking at the creation of Eve, God wanted to copy Adam's perfectly sequenced DNA to make her the perfectly suitable partner. Here comes the astounding answer to the question of why the rib. Only in recent times have we discovered that only the rib of the human, and with various animals that we found, is the only bone in the body that can actually grow back. Many assume that Adam lived out the rest of his life with one rib missing, but in fact, after time, it actually grew back. If the Bible was just some fairy tale fiction as many atheists claim it is, how would Moses have known this fact, being the writer? Wasn't he just some semi-illiterate goat herder inventing a work of fiction? Just more evidence here to conclude that the Bible was written under the inspiration of God, our Creator. What's more, evolution teaches that we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. However, we now have sequenced DNA for both humans and chimps. Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins, PhD in genetics, has studied these comparisons for years and have found that evolutionists mistakenly use a very preferential and selective treatment of the data when comparing our genes. They use sequences they expect to be similar. They do not include non-aligned DNA, gaps, copy number variations, and size differences. These are legitimate and massive differences between the two which cannot be reconciled. These are massively ignored because they do not fit into the evolutionary story. So how do they make it fit? They only count one type of difference. We are told we are 98 to 99% the same as chimps. However, this 1 to 2% difference represents 450 million differences along the chain of DNA that don't match up at all. This fact is suppressed by the evolution geneticists. Studies using the mitochondrial DNA, or the DNA that was only passed down from maternal ancestry, found that dating for mitochondrial Eve calculates a date of approximately 108,000 to 300,000 years. However, this data assumes human-chimp ancestry. But in 1997, some evolutionists produced another paper stating that mitochondrial Eve was only 6,500 years old. Why the vast difference from the other findings? This paper reveals that the tests do not assume human-chimp ancestry, but rather only human. This age of 6,500 years aligns extremely well with our dating of Adam and Eve by counting back the years throughout the Bible. We have the good fortune that the Old Testament records the ages of each generation from that time, which calculates to roughly 6,000 to 6,500 years ago. We've seen how astronomically impossible it could be for one living organism to come into existence out of non-living matter, and that would be just one organism. We still haven't reconciled how millions of complex organisms could have evolved from an undirected natural process. Because natural selection does not dictate to other non-living matter in other parts of the world and across the seas on how to evolve as well. Each and every one of those events need to go through the same improbable processes as all others. Given all that we've covered above, should the popular scenario of natural processes of chemical and biological evolution be taught globally as the only explanation of the origin of life and species? It is clear that secular academia are completely unwilling to open their minds to other possibilities or other explanations. Popular science itself stresses that if observations and data contradict your testing, then the theory should be modified or abandoned. Unfortunately, however, this is clearly not happening within our present study of accepted evolution. Instead, what is happening is that these scientists take the information they receive and make it fit the evolutionary model. Is that a good scientific practice? We can see without a shadow of a doubt that there is undeniable bias going on within the scientific community. Geosociety and their definition of the nature of science and the scientific method says, to be scientific in our era is to search for solely natural explanations. What? This is an intentional exclusion based on their definition of quote-unquote true science. Therefore, before the race even begins, the winner has already been declared. Really? Defining the word science to fit your academic worldview is like defining the rules to a game to ensure that you always win. Such bias runs deep into the entire thought process about any given genetic development in living things. For example, some evolutionists have claimed that the compound I in the honeybee is a bad design that no good designer would use, so it must have evolved. However, it is actually an excellent design for small creatures, enabling bees to navigate by the highly efficient optic flow method, all centrally controlled by a navigation software packed into a brain the size of a sesame seed. Evolution scientists argue against using the term design in nature, and they go so far as to state that teaching intelligent design isn't science. However, the best robotics engineers have yet to design a navigation program as good as a bee's and run it on a chip with the energy efficiency of a bee's brain. So it's reasonable to believe that the bee was designed by a master programmer whose intelligence is beyond our own. Critical thinking is required to realize that scientific findings do not violate the principles of information science. Too often, scientists believe that information can be generated by physical processes, yet we know that simply is not possible. Functional information cannot be generated from purely physical properties. Functional information has never been observed to arise purely by physical interactions. And just to touch on one more aspect of the creation of life, we cannot fail to talk about consciousness. Life doesn't just comprise of living matter in the form of a physical being. It is also conscious. You and I are conscious of ourselves and the world around us. Now what or how on earth could give rise to that? We can see how the mechanics of protein be pulled together, something purely intangible as our sentience or awareness of existence. Most honest atheists agree that evolutionary processes cannot explain the existence of human consciousness, yet they still cling to the belief that some as yet undiscovered natural process gave rise to it. Cognitive scientist Professor Jerry Fedor states, "Nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Not only can they not explain it, but they can't even define it. In contrast, the Bible provides a wholly satisfactory framework upon which to build and understand human nature. The scriptures tell us we are much more than just a body or a biochemical mechanism. When we were created, we were given an immaterial soul and a spiritual nature, with it fully conscious and aware mind to discern, navigate, and explore this beautiful world He put us in." Join me next time where we explore the plethora of evidence for the global catastrophe that destroyed our world, the Great Flood. Here on Evidence Uncovered.